Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide divorce mediation and valuation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we are going to discuss passive appreciation in separate property in divorce and the external market forces with Dr. Ashok Abbott. He's an associate professor of finance at West Virginia University and founder of Business Valuation Incorporated, where he provides value by determining statistical significance, validating economic models, establishing causality, and providing rigorous empirical support. So major research, a wonderful professor. Welcome, Dr. Abbott. How are you today?
Lisa, it's always a pleasure to be here with you.
Yes, and you are always doing amazing research. And this is kind of an area that we've touched on, this passive appreciation, but we're kind of taking this one step further and discussing the specific external market forces and basically the way to prove what portion of the passive appreciation is related to the market. And so I think that, just starting off, I think we just have to understand a little bit about what do you consider market forces and how do you describe it? And then how can we start to identify them when we're doing a valuation in divorce?
Right. See, that is something which is very interesting because in most states, statute says any appreciation as a result of market forces can be separate property, okay, which is fine and simple, except most states do not just stop there. They just say external market forces, things that are happening outside the purview of the management. But then they stop there. Some of them, like Massachusetts, for example, goes ahead and says external market forces, for example, inflation, and they stop there. Okay. So then it's left to whosoever is claiming that passive appreciation to make a case for what are the forces, what are the things that are impacting the business that are outside the control of the individual owner or the managers of that business, which comes a tall order if you're just starting to look at it from inside out. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do we look from outside in? No business is operating, prospering, declining in a vacuum. Okay. You are providing a product or a service, and you need a consumer that has the need for that service, the desire for that service or product, and the means to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And most important, the willingness to pay for it. Only when you have these four conditions together, the means, the desire, the willingness, and the ability, that is when a market forces can be identified that is impacting the business.
Yeah, and I think you have a good point that, a lot of times when we're trying to prove out this piece that's a little subjective, which I love this idea whenever, we were talking about last time, is that if you could, and maybe it's not just industry issues, right? It's economic issues. It's bigger than just that particular industry or that particular company. But when you are kind of identifying these market forces, how do they then relate to the business valuation? Like, how do you incorporate them or how do you use them in that capacity?
So remember the kind of the catechism of valuation, revenue ruling 5960, says economic conditions is a major factor in what the business is worth at a given point in time. Right? And that's where we need to go, is what are the economic conditions? What are the conditions that are impacting this business? Because not all businesses are impacted by all conditions all the time. Okay? So the changes that occur over time, especially in this case, during the course of that marriage, when the starting point is the value at the beginning and the ending point is the value at the end. What are these factors that impact this business that are most important, having an influence on the performance of this business? It could be its ability to sell, it could be its ability to make money, it could be its ability to be for the valuation person to put that revenue stream and expense stream into net cash flows and then apply the appropriate discount to create a value. So these are all factors that come into play. Okay. So we have what we would call the cash flows that are coming into the business and the rate at which they are being discounted. And important thing is that we are not talking about an individual being extremely personable or a good provider of a particular service or product. An artist that paints a beautiful mural is in demand. But there has to be someone who needs that mural to be painted or wants that mural to be painted and has the ability to pay for it and sees any benefit coming out of it. Okay.
Right.
So that's where we come to this distinction between what are these extra, aside from the desire and the ability of the customer to pay for it, what is bringing together that demand and that supply so that an exchange takes place.
Well, and I think we could even use the pandemic as a good example.
That's a good example.
That everybody, is like, well, the pandemic must have lowered everybody's cash flow. That's not really specific. Like, yeah.
Look at Amazon. What has pandemic done for them?
Right.
Shifted retail out of storefronts into Amazon's warehouses. I mean, they have almost tripled their daily deliveries during this period when everything else is shut down.
Right. Well, and the market forces could affect different providers in the same industry differently as well.
Right. Depending on, even though we say the same industry, question is, what is really the industry, the sub-niche that we are talking about?
Right.
And as we start today looking at, for example, population, the customers that are available. Okay. Population may not be just individuals. It can be institutions. It can be any entity that consumes that product or service from the perspective of valuation is a consumer. That's the population we are looking for.
Understood.
Right. So that's why it's extremely important, rather than just saying population went up at a rate of 0.5% per year over the last century in US. Now, question is, who are these individuals that we are talking about? Or who are these entities that we are talking about? Okay. Selling on a business-to-business market is very different than selling to a business-to-consumer market. Okay. So when we look at population, we have to see what is the population that we are talking about. Okay. And the beauty is that your tax dollars pay for a wealth of information that is created and disseminated and is available for free for any practitioner. You have different age groups. You have ethnic buildups. You have male-female classifications. You have children. You have adults. You have retirees. All of these different groups are identified and tabulated. So you don't have to do that. That work has already been done, and you have already paid for it through your taxes. So might as well use it.
Right. And government data is really good to use in litigation formats. Right. So I think it's helpful.
See, because then the situation, you do not have to prove that this number is true. Whereas if, let's say, we did a sample survey of a population,
Right.
in a particular county, we went to all the businesses and said, oh, how much do you spend in postage every month? Is that reliable information? Maybe not, because
Right.
what percentage of population you're going to be able to survey?
Right.
Okay, it's a question of resources. Okay, but the data that are available, that are put together for you using your tax dollars, are already tabulated. You can go down to county level, statistical area level, and you know what is the number of individuals, how many children are there, how many women are there, how many men are there, how many retirees are there, how many people of working age are there, how many teenagers, how many tweens. All of this information is readily available and out there.
Well, and once you can identify either the population change or growth, that's going to also correlate in some capacity, maybe not, to how does personal income and population then change consumption, right?
See, that is the key, because consumption is the key to your revenues. What you produce, somebody has to consume to pay for it. And when they pay, that becomes the money that is coming into the business. That's your cash inflow. Okay. So the idea here is that if you can put together a good enough, clean enough cross-section of your buyers and their ability to pay, then you do have a good handle on how the revenues would be impacted.
Well, and I think this is a very interesting concept, because consumption right now, since we have so many things on the internet and social media, you have a lot of businesses that will be posting on social media or do something, and it drastically affects their business. And in some capacity, that's not really a market force, that's their own force. But it is a reaction to kind of their persona of the business a little bit.
So they can stimulate that demand at a particular point in time, but they cannot keep on stimulating it every minute.
Right.
So that's what happens. I mean, like those flash sales that you get, typically, where are you going to get a flash sale? It's a retailer that has a relatively high value product that they want to reach out to that high capacity buyer, and by offering this for a short period of time, they can make that sale there and then.
Yeah, and it plays upon everybody wants a deal, but you also get the scarcity in there of like, well, it's going to end. Hurry up, hurry up.
4 hours.
Yeah.
It's a 4-hour window
that
they give it for. I mean, my daughter buys that stuff, so I know.
Right. Well, and so if you talk about population, you have personal income and you have population changes, but another factor that you have is inflation. And I think people just kind of, they conceptually know what inflation is, but how does that play into this kind of analysis?
See, inflation kind of myth has grown around inflation in economic data, especially in valuation. So somebody just comes on the stand and says, Your Honor, this is a 12-year period. The annual inflation rate, look at CPI, has been about 2 to 2.5% per year. So compounding over these 12 years, the revenues have grown by 75% as a result of inflation alone. So if the revenues have doubled, 75% of that 100% is passive. That's a very common, and on the face of it, it looks plausible. Sure, the revenues are going up, even if the demand is not going up, even if the number of products being sold is not going up, well, just the inflation raised the price.
Yeah. And everybody loves simple, right?
Simple, right?
Yeah.
That's easy to wrap your head around. Except when you actually start peeling off this onion, what do you see? Inflation, the way inflation is known, is some kind of a index, consumer price index, CPI, common way to look at inflation. And it's very appealing. It's very standardized data. You start with the prices for a particular basket of consumption at a point in time. Like right now, what we have is the 2012. So the CPI that is being published every month is based on the price of those goods as of that month in 2012. Okay. Except, and that except is always where valuations become interesting. When we talk about inflation, it says all goods purchased by all consumers. Okay, all right, that's perfectly okay. However, it's interesting when you start looking for these indexes, there's also an index that says the price of new cars has changed by so much.
Right.
Year after year. The price of used cars has changed by so much. The price of food has changed by so much. Price of food and beverages has changed by so much. All of those indexes are available. Construction materials. So if we just take the CPI and apply it, let's say, to a bar, which may be an acceptable approximation, because the price of food and drink typically passes through the inflation. Okay. Now, if you take that same CPI and apply it to a car dealership, what has happened?
Right.
You have overestimated that inflation by about 5 times.
Right.
Because the new auto price inflation is much slower than the CPI, the consumer product inflation. Typically, the more necessary some product is, like food, for example, it's easy for the producer and the retailer to pass through that inflation to the customer.
Sure.
Because your can of milk, it goes from $2 to $2.20. You're not going to stop using that milk.
Right.
Okay. Now, if the price of your car goes from 30,000 to 36,000, you might say, okay, maybe I should go to the next dealership and look at another competing brand. So the ability of the higher the unit price of the product, the ability and less of a necessity it is, the ability of the producer to pass inflation on to the consumer gets limited. Look at airline travel. Over the last about 30 years, the per seat mile price has not changed. If anything, it has come down. I mean, especially if you're flying coach or business. The first class prices have stayed about the same. They have not inflated. But if you start looking at the per mile cost of flying coach or business, that has declined over the last 20 years. So if you were taking, for example, a travel agency's revenue and then applying CPI to it, you will be overestimating that growth by a very large factor.
That's very important. And I think that, you may have to search a little bit more for the data that's for each specific niche or industry, but it may be more complete and more indicative of the change, right?
And most important, see, if you are in litigation, what's going to happen? The other expert is going to find that data.
Right.
And is going to come in with that. Like when I'm involved in that, I will narrow down my data set to something that as closely approximates what is the particular business. And when you do that, and the other side just comes with the macro inflation or the macro interest rates all interest rates are not impacting it same way. All populations are not impacting it same way.
Yeah.
So that is where we come in. So we have to see.
And you mentioned interest rates, and I
Right.
think that one thing that we saw during the pandemic is that interest rates went really low, and now interest rates I feel like are climbing back a little bit, little bit, and will continue to change. But when those interest rates change, do they also change consumption, and how?
Some do and some don't.
Okay.
See, that's the thing. Again, it's going into the detail.
Mm-hmm.
If you are, and this is something which, when I was working on a relatively large case a couple of years ago, it came out that depending on the population that is consuming your particular product, what are their major expenses? And interestingly, it came out that for this particular product, which was a consumer product, the automobile car loan interest became a much bigger factor than mortgage interest.
Mm.
And you started looking at it and said, why? Because mortgages are typically the largest purchase that someone makes. They take the largest chunk of your income.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, that impacts your disposable income, that impacts your consumption. But why is that interest rate not showing up?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you start looking at it, you say, who are the people who are buying these products? Young, urban professionals.
Mm.
That was the market. And what we found was that market is not really buying a house at that stage in their life.
Mm-hmm.
This was a product that young professionals, 25 to 34 years old, were the single largest block that was buying this product.
Mm.
And that is the block that usually at that point, in this population demographic, does not own a home or is not buying one at that point.
Sure.
I mean, if they are in a really large place like New York, the cost to buy a house or livable house for them is going to be very high. So where do they spend their money on?
Stuff.
In this case, these are they are not tweens. They are making some good money.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of their first big purchase ends up being a luxury car rather than a home.
Yeah.
So that was the interesting factor that came in. And when you do that, then it makes sense. I mean, for them, the biggest chunk of their monthly income is the car payment they are making, not a home mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see that, then you see that what they're really doing is they are looking first at buying that status car. I mean, everyone wants to, when they go to a club or they go to a meeting, they want to be stepping out of this high-priced car.
Right.
To be seen in it. And a lot of them are buying it for that. It's not, I mean, in New York, car is not a very practical transportation medium. Right? But they're doing that. So the biggest expense that they had, single fixed expense, was this monthly car payment.
Mm.
And since that, depending on what the automobile loans interest rate was, so that it was interesting that this product has nothing to do with the car. But the consumption determinant became how much the disposable income was changing as a result of buying that very expensive car.
Mm-hmm.
So
and as the rates maybe go down, they can buy a bigger car, larger payment.
Even with a bigger car, they can now they have more money left over to buy this other luxury good that was being marketed to them.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very expensive accessory from Louis Vuitton.
Of course.
And so, I mean, basically, somebody who buys a BMW is the same one who buys that Louis Vuitton accessory.
Right.
So this was interesting. See, that's what happens when you start really analyzing, when you have to step into the skin of the business to see, then from there, look outside and see what is really coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to
Well,
match.
yeah, and I think it's interesting because you do have to pay attention to consumer behavior and
Right.
what's motivating it. I think it's interesting to look at Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts.
Yeah.
And only because I have kind of tweens or early teenagers do I know that Starbucks kind of caters to the moms and the on the go and everything. And then Dunkin' Donuts really probably should have died a long time ago, but the kids are what has like given it new life.
Right.
And they more prefer like the drinks at Dunkin' Donuts. And obviously, I don't really think it's about the donuts anymore, but it became cool in the population.
The high sugar.
Mm-hmm.
It's the high sugar intake that they get there.
Exactly.
And they don't like the bitter coffee.
Right. It's no longer coffee. It's just like fluff.
It's fluff. It's
Yeah.
like the dark chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it was another similar high-valued thing.
Well, dark chocolate is healthy, Dr. Abbott. It's healthy.
Yes, and the adults do consume that.
Right.
When you get your mocha, what you are going to put in that or what you want in that is different than what a 12-year-old wants to get that big gulp.
Mm-hmm.
Two different markets.
Yeah, completely.
So that's the thing. The product, the market, and the value, they go together.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and another thing that we have dealt with in the pandemic, or that we've seen more of, is kind of this unemployment issue. And so what is some of the difference between short-term unemployment and long-term unemployment? And like, where are we right now, really?
Big difference. Big difference.
And then how does it affect consumption? Because it is a lower level of earning, and that, maybe covers some of your basic needs, but it doesn't leave a lot left over for extra items.
Right. See, that is something which is kind of the classical economics had not thought about. Because remember, when Adam Smith was writing his stuff, or when John Keynes was looking at the markets, what did you have? You had essentially, if you're unemployed, you didn't have any money, you couldn't buy food, you couldn't buy shoes. What has changed, especially over the last 30 years or so, is that the impact of short-term unemployment is not very significant on the necessities. See, an unemployed person or someone who is out of a job looking for another job, see, the median time that you spend looking for a job once you have lost one, not during the pandemic, but earlier, up to 2018, was less than 6 months. In most cases, it was around 3 months.
Okay.
So a lot of individuals would not feel a very big need to change their consumption behavior in the short run. So if you're in between jobs, you say, okay, next month I'll have a job, or you're having interviews, it's unlikely that you will stop buying that can of milk. Now, you may cut down on your Starbucks coffee.
Right.
Instead of 3 a day, you might get 2 a day. Or instead of a latte, you might be getting a mocha, right? So that kind of change, subtle change, small change occurs, but not a big, I'm not going to spend money on this. That happens only when there is long-term unemployment. And statistically, we make the distinction between 6 months is the time period, because that's typically when most individuals that we have in that working age population had kind of start running out of the reserves. So when long-term unemployment hits, then consumption behavior changes significantly. For example, in a particular area, like we have in West Virginia, in southern part of the state, coal mines have shut down. Because that's high sulfur coal, and with these current, as the market is evolving, they're looking at low pollution situations. So that coal has lost its market. And there is systemic unemployment that then enters the marketplace. Okay. So there, the consumption behaviors are very different than they are from the northern part of the state, which had never been dependent on mining. So the demographics change, and you have to know what you're dealing with. So you have to go in that area and see, look in that. And again, since the data are available right down to county level, you know how much employment is there. Has it been increasing? Is it steady? Is it declining? And that gives you real clues about what the consumption behaviors are changing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So during pandemic, for example, this was a good example with the economic stimulus. Okay, what happened was that in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, individuals that were on unemployment were with the supplement were getting about the same amount of money, or sometimes even slightly more money than they were when they were employed. So looking at that time period and saying, hey, the unemployment is not important, it doesn't impact consumption, you have to go back beyond that and see why it did not impact consumption. Because the disposable income did not change or change marginally for a group. Now, if you are making substantially more than the minimum, the change in your income is going to be much more when you're employed or unemployed. But for the bulk of consumers, we are talking about at least 60% of the population that lives below the median, at the median. Income and population are, we have decoupled them, kind of. So as the income inequality increases, we see that a smaller and smaller proportion of the population has more and more of the income. So any changes in, for example, when let's say a stockbroker on Wall Street loses a job, $1 million a year, $1.5 million a year, his consumption is going to change.
Right. And if you have a whole industry that sees tremendous layoffs or something like that, or, when we've had crises in different industries, you could see the same effects.
You can see the same effect. Like if, for example, major industrial, like Detroit, you can see that. See, as automobile production has shifted, if you go into Eastern Ohio, that's the Panera Bread and all they are headquartered there. When you look at that area, as automobile production U.S. domestic automobile production has started shutting down, there are huge swaths. You're looking at 3-county, 4-county areas that have been decimated economically. So per capita consumption has come down very significantly. So businesses that need someone to have a high income, high disposable income, those businesses don't have a future in those areas anymore.
Well, and I think another kind of nuance to that is like with the pandemic, I feel like people are moving from like urban locations further out because it's cheaper, you get more of a house or more of an apartment or anything. But as that population shifts, you're now you're going to go to gas stations and Walgreens and all of those near your house, your new house that's, 20 miles in a different location and working from home, all of those types of things kind of shift your consumption.
Or in a different state. So New York is losing a lot of population right now. And,
I'm sure.
Especially with work from home becoming the new norm. So that ripples through the whole economy. Yeah. The office buildings, those leases are not going to get renewed to a large extent. Most of businesses have figured out. So this is a technological change that was coming, but may have come in another 50 years.
Right. Or a lot
People,
sooner than I
lot
expected.
sooner than everybody expected. With work from home, essentially, the finally the businesses have figured out that it is possible to work remotely and work efficiently. Because they're in fact, the productivity per person has improved during this time of work from home. So people are willing to check their emails once before they go to bed at 8 or 9 or 10 in the night, rather than stopping at 4:30 and saying, okay, I'm done. Now I will look at it tomorrow.
Well, and I think also, like we talked about earlier, luxury cars. Well, if you're not driving to work and you're not driving to restaurants and things like that, like I could imagine that over this time, not only has income gone down, but the consumption of those types of goods, because they were a lot of it was for show, and if you're not showing anybody and you just have this luxury car in your garage, and if you're in New York, you probably have to pay for parking, like it would start to be like, do I really need all of this stuff? Yeah.
So you buy now basically the same person who would have bought a sports car is buying that mom wagon.
Yep.
Because you are in this remote location, you have to carry more stuff around from somewhere. We say, okay, I'll take something that works. See, for example, in demographics, I mean, one of the things that we saw was that the new cars, new, bigger cars, what drives their sales? Families with young children. So you would not expect a young child population to have an impact. They're not buying cars, they're not riding cars, but the parents are. So that's what you find, that for new cars, for new, bigger cars, the sub 15 population is a big driver. So as that part of the population increases, people are buying bigger cars, and you have children, you buy a newer car, you buy something which has more safety features. So that's turning to be the most profitable segment in automobile industry.
Right.
And it kind of very closely ties in to the demographics of the area. You're buying these cars where there are young children and where the parents, of course, could have bought the car, but instead of buying now this sporty roadster, they're buying this big car,
right,
with a lot of baby seats in there.
Right. And in the reverse, I know we're talking about cars a lot, but even electric cars, I think as people work from home more and they're like, well, I'm really only going in a 10-mile radius from my house or 15 miles.
Get a plug-in.
Electric cars make a lot more sense, right?
Overall, globally, see, one of the things that electric cars have been slower to catch on in the US is that on an average, we are much more spread out than, for example, Europe is.
Right.
So we tend to drive longer distances. So a long range becomes very important. But let's say you're in London. The whole thing is within a 30-mile radius. In any direction, you are not going more than 15 miles. You can go and come back on a single charge.
Right.
So,
well, and as stations, I think the charging stations, I've talked to a couple businesses that are going to be, like part of that infrastructure is huge.
And it's coming up. See, even here, now what's happening? A lot of people, a lot of big businesses are going to be putting in these charging stations in their own parking lots. So again, you're being a magnet for a particular population segment that you can sell to.
Right. Come back to work. No, just kidding.
Come back to work.
Well, and another area that I think is interesting is consumer confidence. So how does that affect, first of all, people might need like a description of what that actually means. And then how does that affect consumption and such?
See, that is a very interesting sub-area. When we say consumer confidence or we say consumer sentiment, these are really two different concepts that just like inflation have been kind of muddled into that same myth. Consumer confidence is how confident the consumer is in their ability to pay for a good or service. Sentiment is how much do they want it at that point in time.
Sure.
However, what has happened in marketing is the two have been kind of commingled. Okay. So the terms are interchangeably used.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that once you have looked at the income and employment, that is the continuing ability to pay for something.
Mm-hmm.
Right? At that point, because the consumer confidence comes from the ability to pay for something to buy in future. So if you have accounted for the impact of employment and income, consumer confidence does not add anything to that analysis.
Okay.
So it becomes insignificant when you add it after using those two.
Because it's just the ability to pay. You have income to pay.
Right.
Or debt.
Or debt. So because it's beyond going to be borrow money only if you have the ability to pay it back.
Mm-hmm.
And what does the lender look for? You walk in and say, I want this loan. They say, sure. Where's your W-2? Let's take a look at it. And how long have you been employed? And how steady the employment history is, how many times they've changed their residence. Mm-hmm. All of that factors into the decision to lend that money or not lend that money.
Right.
Okay. So, and the ability to get that money to pay for the good or service is the difference between buying or not buying the product.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So that's what we see here is that interplay, and that interplay is captured in the underlying variables. So if you're not looking at them, for example, IBS, they provide all these business reports. Mm-hmm. They talk a lot about disposable income and consumer confidence. Mm-hmm. But the confidence is a byproduct of income.
So you're kind of saying it would be duplicative. It would be
duplicative. And if you put that in a model, when you're doing a real rigorous analysis, you will find that once you have put the employment and income in the model, confidence level becomes insignificant. It doesn't impact anything more.
Gotcha.
Well, so it's a combination that you have to work at.
Yeah. And I think it's important to understand the nuance because obviously I didn't even say the other word because I was like, oh, they're the same. It's no big deal. But it's another little misnomer, right?
See, that's what happens most of the time. The concepts that are very valid in generality cease being valid when you go to particulars. The devil is always in the details.
Right, exactly.
So when you have someone that just basically comes in and says inflation, oh, this is all inflation. We really don't need to look at it. This is all passive. Mm-hmm. That's when you go in and say, okay, let's take a look. Mm-hmm. How did inflation really impact this? And then you find, for example, that for new cars, the inflation impact is only about 10% of the increase in inflation. 90% it does not impact that.
Very interesting. Yeah. Well, and one more question I think we have today is, what typically changes the index levels of income and employment and why?
Right. See, whenever we talk about an index, we are talking about a base number and what the change is from that number. Like Dow Jones Index, for example.
Sure.
Everybody looks at Dow went up, Dow went down. We are at 30,000, we are at 28,000. We're at 20,000. What has happened? So what has happened? At one point, essentially, they said, okay, as of this date, this 35 stock basket, if it was $1,000 worth, how much is the 35 largest industrial stocks today? How much are they worth compared to that? And that's what this, when we say Dow is 30,000, we're saying that $1,000 has become $30,000.
Sure.
That's all we're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So an index is simply a comparison to a point in time historically. So the index value is set at 100 when the index starts, and then you keep on comparing that value. So with population, for example, it would be the population has gone up from 1 million to 5 million over these 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So your index is 500% of what it was. Employment, again, the same thing. It's if people were gainfully employed 100% of the time, what population of that group is now employed or not employed?
Mm-hmm.
See, so the interesting thing is that, again, in the details,
Right.
when we talk about unemployment running at 3%, 5%, 10%, at the height of the pandemic, 18%, what are we talking about? We are not talking about the total population of that, how many are unemployed. We are looking at the working age population, people who are looking for work, how many of those are unemployed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when someone stops looking for work, they drop out of this information. They're no longer, the percentage is not being calculated out of that.
Right.
So the companion index that is available is what percentage of working age population is employed. And there again, there are very significant differences among different subgroups. I mean, the first one being, of course, men and women.
Right.
Of the working age men, at any point in time, the percentage that is employed is 20 to 30% higher than working age women percentage that are employed.
Mm.
Okay. So fundamental saying unemployment went up from 3% to 5%, things must be bad or things may be good, is very different. You're looking at who is buying your product.
Mm-hmm.
And in that group, what is the unemployment, what is the employment, what is their average income?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to make a big difference.
Like
For
if
example,
your product was going to like working moms or something,
and moms
unemployment,
are,
yeah,
so
they're out of that.
Right. Their unemployment you should be looking at.
Mm-hmm.
See, during the pandemic, the rate of unemployment for women was about 3 times at the very bottom of the pandemic. The unemployment rate for women was 3 times the rate of unemployment for men.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just took the unemployment index and applied it and said, well, this percentage is not employed, therefore we expect this much drop in sales or revenues for this business. Not quite true. Depending on who's the buyer. Like, just look at the women's apparel store, men's apparel store.
Mm-hmm.
When the unemployment for women becomes 3 times that much, and on an average they spend between 2.5 to 3 times as much.
Mm-hmm.
Proportionate decline in revenues for women's apparel stores is going to be significantly higher than for men's apparel stores.
Right, right.
And as even when the pandemic lifts, if work from home continues, you know what's going to happen to apparel stores.
Well, sweatpants are going to be really popular. They're going to
see the new name for
wear,
that, right? Athleisure.
Yeah, athleisure. Yes.
Yeah, athleisure is the new word for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so those stores are doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Those stores selling through Amazon are doing extremely well.
Right. Well, and I think that globally, as we're talking about all of these economic factors, you really just can't assume that whatever your experience is what's happening in the world. You have to look at the data. You have to look at this particular company, its location, its industry, all of that,
Where the
and then
customers are.
logically talk it through, right?
Right? That's the important part. The more you go into details, higher the quality of your analysis becomes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the really critical part, is to be knowing where you are, who you are selling to, what
Mm-hmm.
what are the other products they're buying,
Mm-hmm.
where is that income coming from, how much of it is getting spent. So that information has to be, see, that is why really you cannot do an active passive analysis in isolation from the valuation of the business.
Mm-hmm. Well,
See,
and do you think, just talking to the owner, do you think that they even perceive or understand all of these factors?
see, that was surprising. When you start talking to people, they do not like to admit that, of course, in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time, they do have a fairly good intuitive. They may not
Mm-hmm.
know the numbers, but when you
Right,
say, who is buying your product?
right,
What age group are they? What, in some cases, some products are very ethnically specific. So
right.
what ethnicity is it? Okay. Where do they live? Urban, semi-urban, rural?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that information, they have an intuitive understanding of that, especially if they're successful. They know who they're selling to.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where you really need to do an in-depth interview.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes if it's not an individual that's running the business, but a team is, you need to really spend some time talking to them. And when I say talking, not talking, but listening to them.
Mm-hmm.
They can give you much more information.
Yeah, I think they can give you the keys that you
Right.
need to then go out and look at the data
Unlock.
and interpret it,
Right.
right?
Because otherwise, if you're simply data mining,
Mm-hmm.
then your conclusions are subject to challenge.
Right, right.
But if you start, see, what you need is a touchstone. The analysis has to be the touchstone, not a fishing rod.
Sure, sure.
You,
Absolutely.
you don't just go out and look for, okay, what seems to be correlated, and then come back and say, okay, how would I explain this?
Mm-hmm. And definitely don't go look for data that just supports your position.
Because the other expert is going to have the data that
Right.
contradicts your position.
Correct. Correct.
Right?
That's what a lot of times I'm telling clients. I'm like, I'm just trying to find the data that the other expert might find as well. I mean, because information's information. You can't just ignore it. You have
No,
to, sometimes you have to incorporate it and say why it's not
right.
applicable, right?
See, the knowing why something won't work or should not work is as important as knowing what is working.
Absolutely. It's a good
And
point.
as an analyst, as a valuation person, you have to look at the totality of things.
Mm-hmm.
And your conclusions or your analysis should be able to withstand what potentially can be thrown at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This
Knowing what they want and then knowing what is real is the key to winning a case.
oh, hands down. And I think that, doing your due diligence and research is really helpful, especially if you're going to deal with this type of passive appreciation, or if there's going to be some claim to separate property, you're going to have to prove that concept.
Even the valuation.
Mm-hmm.
So because essentially, if, for example, like in one of the cases that you were involved in,
Mm-hmm.
if the discount rate that someone is using is 20%, 30% more than what you have determined, you need to be able to explain as to why the number that you are using is the correct number and why the number they're using is incorrect
Mm-hmm.
number.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
small change, for example, in growth rate, applied at the beginning of the business, applied at the end of the marriage, can make a huge difference in what the change in value over that period.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be really careful.
Well, and you bring up a good point because, I'm sure people who are doing divorce understand this, but each state is specific. And there's there's certain states that will have like the date of filing is the date of the value, or the date of separation was the date of the value, or the date of trial is the date of the value. And so right now we are in such a changing environment that becomes very important.
Very important. See, in Carolina, for example, it's really important. I mean, they have some of the most advanced statutes in divorce valuation, and they have the passive up to the point of filing, or at the point of divorce. I mean, basically, and then from beyond that to the dissolution, it flips. So
that doesn't sound fun.
So you have to do 3 valuations.
Right.
One in the beginning of the marriage, one at the whatever the date is, if they say dissolution or filing, and one when the actual, because in a lot of very complex divorces, you may have 2 or 3 or 5 years pass from the time that the divorce is filed and the divorce is finalized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you have this third piece where you're looking at, okay, beyond this point, now the active is no longer to be shared, but the passive is to be shared. So they flip that. They say, okay, from this point on, the efforts belong to the individual. The non-effort part belongs to the marital estate.
Right. Right.
Whereas before that, it's the other way around.
Yeah. No, and it's fascinating, especially when you have a situation where, we have one now that the date of separation was several years ago.
Right.
And that is by statute, the date that we have to use, so it's like, it doesn't make logical sense, but that's what it says. So
all the decline in value might be going to the owner manager in that situation.
Right. And a lot of times, you can't, changing statutes in case law in any state is very difficult, especially when you have like 90% of cases settle. And right now, 99% of cases probably are not making it to trial.
Nobody does.
Yeah.
So that's what happens. I mean, people are very worked up when the process starts.
Right.
Then when they start seeing the legal bills mount and the costs mount, then gradually that realization comes, okay, let's just get it done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And that's part of what the judicial process is, that to bring people to a point of compromise rather than contention. Where, I mean, essentially you could spend 70% of an estate's value on litigation, smaller estates.
Right.
So that's the way things are.
That's awesome. Well, economics wasn't my favorite area in school, but you have done an amazing job at kind of breaking it down into bite-sized pieces, and the nuances, it really has given me some food for thought. Like maybe I need to beef up some things too, but I think that this is the way to contact you, because you do also testify in court.
Yes,
and you also provide analysis for people, and maybe even consulting for other valuation people that need some of this work.
That's the largest part of my work, is helping the valuation person with specific nuances that ordinarily, it's simply a fact of life, how you are prepared for something. And my I did not start in economics. I started in physics.
Oh, even better, right? No.
That's where my degree is. So, and then, of course, my doctorate is in finance. But that's how it happens. So your thinking process becomes that logical bite size that you learn from the hard sciences. And when you start applying that to numbers, starts making a little bit more sense than ad hoc. Let's throw spaghetti.
Absolutely. And in this process, we're actually going to talk about some of those specific industries.
Yes.
So if people have any suggestions of industries, they can certainly maybe
Send
email
it.
you or post it on this video. But I think it'll start to really make sense when we start to dissect an industry and people can understand the nuances of this process.
That's the whole idea. The idea is that there is a wealth of data that are available.
Mm-hmm.
They are for free. I mean, not free, but because your taxes have already paid for them.
Right.
So the idea is to get the information that's out there, that is available to you, and to give you the tools to analyze that information in a way that it can become useful.
Yes. And so hopefully we'll have some kind of examples and maybe walk through some of the process in a more visual way. But so look forward to that. But we appreciate you, Dr. Abbott, and it's always a pleasure.
You're most welcome. And you have created this good forum. You're bringing in information from every aspect of the industry and putting that in one place. So you're becoming the hub for that information. And
that's great.
That's a very critical function that the industry needs.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for doing
appreciate it. Thank you. All right. Well, we'll see you next time when we talk about an industry.
We will do that.
Thank you.
Look forward to it. Thank you. Bye then.